Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on COVID-19's impact on women in Utah. The pandemic's impacted all of us in profound ways. However, new research finds that women's employment and careers were disproportionately impacted during the past year. And tonight we're going to explore what the latest data shows about the pandemic's impact specifically on women. Joining us for this live panel discussion, Dr. Susan Madsen, Director of the Utah Women in Leadership Project at Utah State University, and Dr. Sarah McPhee-Lapkus, Assistant Professor of Social Work at UVU. Thank you both for joining us here tonight.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for having me.
We really appreciate it. This show is so fun because you can really go into depth on these topics. So we're interested. Dr. Madsen, let's start here. Researchers with the Utah Women in Leadership Project conducted an extensive, in-depth survey focused on the impacts of COVID-19 on women and work. Could you explain a little bit about how many people participated in the survey and then what their demographics are?
Absolutely. So I did this first brief really with Drs. Hansen and Hartwell from Utah State University, just giving them some credit as well. But we have a series of reports that are going to come out. This is just the first, and we have data from almost 3,600 women in the state of Utah. And this one really looks at quantitative data, so numbers. The one next month will be qualitative. So even with that, we had we had over 2,700 responses for that. So we have some great data. This is just the first piece of that. So we had women from all ages, from 20 to, I think the oldest we saw was about in their 80s. We actually had a lot of married folks, but we had even though we had education across the board, we had more educated people than uneducated people. And we did get some folks from every county in the state of Utah, which we're excited about having that, and people from different industries. So overall, what we did find, just let me give you a little bit of the background here.
Please do.
So overall, what we found was that about 16% of women who answered our survey, and just so you know, some of the people in probably the direst need didn't answer the survey, so we think it's really higher. But about 16% said that they really withdrew, they left the workplace for different reasons, from their employer shutting down, from just not being able to handle the work, the homeschooling, the child care, all of those things. Maybe they shifted from full-time to part-time, and some of them just totally left. We did have some that did increase their work hours because their spouses were unemployed.
That's what's so interesting about this past year is everybody's story is so unique, but then you hear this and there are many women out there who may have had the similar type journey as you, whoever's out there listening at this point. Dr. Lapkus, let's go to a question here. A number of women experienced a decrease in pay and an increase in work hours during the pandemic, which in turn could lead to more mental and emotional stress. What does the data and research show about their concerns about money, experiencing increased burnout, and then their hopefulness?
Well, of course, Dr. Madsen can speak a lot more to the specifics about the data, but I can certainly weigh in and say that money has been a concern across the demographics with women in this pandemic. Even though the women who had lower incomes in this research showed the most hardest hit concerns, but there were women even in higher incomes who were concerned about money as well. Their financial stress was just huge, and burnout, of course, is huge because there are a lot of women working longer hours. Some are having reduced pay, a lot of overlap between work and home with women working at home. And so that can contribute to burnout, which of course can lead to feelings of increased hopelessness. And of course, that's never good for anyone's mental health. That can lead to depression and anxiety. And a lot of those impacts are being felt strongly by women in Utah.
Dr. Madsen, I'd love to hear any input you can add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. What was interesting is when we measured these perceptions on a 7-point scale. So generally burnout, what was really interesting was we saw significant burnout people agreed, most people agreed, they're feeling burnout. Pretty high levels. Food services was the highest one. And nonprofit, people that worked in nonprofit and community were experiencing the most burnout. But what's interesting is we saw burnout pretty much across different income levels, different industries, different counties, and so forth like that. So, but what I found interesting is we do have higher levels of burnout than we have levels of hope. So I hope that changes. But that's really interesting. I do want to point out as well that we looked at different counties and regions around the state. And the one that makes me smile is the lower levels of burnout was Washington County. Now think about St. George. And the highest levels of hope were actually in St. George, Washington County. And Salt Lake County actually had much higher levels of burnout and a little bit lower levels of hope. So it's interesting to look around the state at the different impacts that women are feeling.
It really is. And again, though, I think we can find, even if we're not feeling hope, just knowing that we're not alone in feeling this hopelessness, at least, or feeling this burnout that I think so many, as you said in your study, have reported feeling. We do have to take a quick break. Dr. Madsen, Dr. Lafkiss, hold this thought where we're at. We're going to head to commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on COVID-19 impact on women in Utah. All right, and welcome back to our In Focus discussion tonight on COVID-19's impact on women in Utah. So before we went to break, we were joined by Dr. Susan Madsen and Dr. Sarah McPhee-Lafkiss. Now we can pick up right where we left off, ladies. Dr. Lafkiss, the pandemic forced a number of women to work remotely from home. Some saw it as a blessing, but others felt even more overwhelmed by it all, juggling working from home, from taking care of their children, helping them remotely from home, and even more. Did you experience any of this, and then what does the data show?
Yeah, certainly. I can just speak a little bit to my own experience, which was especially intense right at the beginning of the pandemic. You know, it was very unexpected. I had a young child in full-time childcare, and she became very ill, like right around that time when everything was shutting down. And to this day, I don't know if she was afflicted by this virus because they wouldn't test her at that point. But she was very sick. We pulled her out of daycare. I was home and working from home and also managing, you know, my kids. And luckily I had a very supportive spouse.
Yes.
But at the same time, it was like, yeah, it was in some ways a blessing because I was able to do all my work from home. I didn't have to go in every day. But at the other side, I felt like I wasn't able to get anything done because everything is in front of me all at once. You know, women, some of the data shows that women do tend to be more perfectionistic in the workplace. And sometimes that can be mitigated if you go to work and you can kind of focus on work when you're there. Or when you're at home, you can sort of focus on home and focus on your children. But when you're working from home, your children are home, your work is at home, and you feel like you're never getting anything done to the level that it needs to be done. And so that can just really add to that sense of perfectionism, that sense of anxiety. It can really contribute to depression, and that was my experience. And I think that the data, Susan can speak to that more, but I think that the data bears that out. Like the feeling of burnout, the feeling of struggling with hope, and just keeping your head above water.
I think those lines blurred all of a sudden, and then there's just no break. There is no break for these working from home parents with kids there now. Yes, Dr. Madsen, let's get you to chime in on this topic as well. Anything you want to add, especially from the data point?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did find in the research, and by the way, there has been a lot of research nationally, and so when we collected our data, mostly in January, I really was wondering, are we going to follow national trends? And we have followed national trends in many ways. But there are some unique things about women in Utah that we'll be uncovering in our data. So in terms of the location, it is great, like Sarah said, it's great to be able to work at home. And we feel like that's a luxury in some ways because some women did not have that option,
right,
and lost their jobs. But what we did find that was interesting is that women who never kept working, but did not switch to working at home, actually had slightly less burnout, had slightly less exhaustion, and felt a little bit less in terms, they didn't feel the mental health decline as much. They are burned out, they are all of this, but the women specifically that weren't used to working some at home, that really did that switch right in a year ago, really struggled even more with that juggling back and forth. So I thought that was interesting. That was a bit of a surprise to me in the data.
Most definitely. This is so interesting to hear because, again, this pandemic, of course, impacting all of us. I know in our home that impacted us entirely, and that those lines were blurred. And I think hearing again that the people are dealing with hopelessness or depression, there were bouts of that seemed really dark and never ending. But hopefully at this point we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Dr. Lafkas, what do we know about how women of color were impacted during the pandemic?
Well, and this is another thing that I would love for Susan to expound upon, having been very close to this data, but I do know that women of color were undersampled in this study. But there were some sampling, there were some responses, of course, from women of color. And a lot of these financial stressors, I think that, Susan, you can confirm, but I believe that the data did suggest that women of color were even more impacted by these financial worries. And a lot of these things were enhanced. And so we're, of course, very concerned about the impact of women, of these stressors and how they've impacted women of color and all women.
We'd love to hear Dr. Madsen more on that specifically. In regards to the women of color, there is research regarding this demographic about their financial worries. What can you tell us about that?
Well, absolutely. What I want to say, though, that another surprising concern to me was that actually, and maybe this is because Utah's doing better with our economy than other states, but what we did find, it was surprising that we were actually lower than I was thinking on financial worries generally across the board. However, when you get into lower economic, household incomes, and particularly women of color, in every area, the women in color had greater concerns than did white women. So we have so many, we did undersample, we worked really hard to get more women of color to take the survey. We got some, but I wish we would have had more. But what we know is there's going to be more emerging data that comes out that will really look at race and other demographics really carefully. But in every income level, the women of color were slightly more concerned in terms of the income, and which is a stress, right? When we're worried about housing and food and just income in general, that adds the stress to women's lives. It adds stress to men too, but we as women actually feel that burden often stronger than men do in the household.
And all of those stressors on top of all of the uncertainty we have out in the community and the world at that point. Yes, it all adds up. Both Dr. Madsen and Dr. Lafkas, we are going to again hold this thought. We'll take another quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on COVID-19's impact on women in Utah. We'll be right back. All right, and welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on COVID-19's impact on women in Utah. Before the break, we were joined by Dr. Susan Madsen and Dr. Sarah McPhee-Lafkas, and Dr. Jessica Hill was supposed to be with us but isn't here tonight. This is all, of course, for a live panel discussion. We do pick up where we left off. Dr. Madsen, turning now to women-owned businesses in Utah, what does the data show regarding women who were classified as entrepreneurs or freelancers?
Great question. So what we did was we researched if they were entrepreneurs and if they only had themselves, right? Or if they were entrepreneurs and employed other people, or if they just worked for somebody else, another company. And we did absolutely find that there was greater worry about money, even on the horizon, will I be okay in a few months? More burnout, those kinds of things, really with women who are entrepreneurs. And that makes sense. More struggles with work life. However, in some of the cases, when you looked at the women who, both entrepreneurs, but one set were women who employed others, those were where you saw some of the strongest numbers. So they were really more stressed. They were in charge of other people and they wanted to help other people and so forth. So we really did see some differences in women that just go to work or work for someone else versus that added stress if you're running your own company as a woman, and especially if you're employing other people.
Oh, most definitely. I can't imagine those stressors. And we want to stick with you, Dr. Madsen, on a very important topic. Part of this conversation tonight, domestic violence. What did the research say about how the pandemic has impacted violence in the home for women right here in Utah?
Well, as you may know, we actually are above the national average in general. I have other reports out there on domestic violence. Typically, what we see in the state of Utah is 1 in 3 women in the state will experience that domestic violence. Now, in this recent study, we asked women who took the study, you know, are you concerned and are you worried about domestic violence or violence in your home? And almost 10%, which is below the 1 in 3, but still that's a staggering number, said, yes, I am very, you know, I agree with this. I'm nervous about this. And to me, that means we have probably thousands of women in the state who really are worried, not only about their kids and not only about everything else, but about having that violence in the home. And Emily, one of the key things, and Sarah could actually talk more to this, is there's something called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And when children experience violence in their home, if they see something happen, if they experience it, the research says that throughout their lives, they're more likely to be on drugs, they're more likely to have criminal behavior. So this is a real serious thing that we really need to do more about in the state of Utah.
That is a crazy number. You're right, 1 in 10, even if it's not the 1 in 3, but to have done this most recent survey and 1 in 10 people saying they're worried about this. Yeah, what can you add to that, Dr. Lafkis?
I mean, I think that Dr. Madsen spoke to it very well. I mean, this is something that we need to be very concerned about as a society in the state, because we have these children who are growing up, who are experiencing, we don't know what the impacts are going to be long term from the pandemic. And certainly not only do you have the stressors of the pandemic, but you possibly have this increased number of children who are being exposed to violence and to the adverse childhood experiences, and you don't know how that's going to impact them long term, which really speaks to the need for increased services and support for families.
Definitely, yes. And Dr. Madsen, what's next when it comes to this research? What topics would you like to see explored or researched in the future? I'm sure this pandemic this year is going to give us many years of research, right?
Absolutely. We actually have this huge data set, so we have plenty of other reports to come out. So the upcoming reports that should be released in the upcoming months will be next month, specifically on career advancement, not just being employed, but career advancement. What are the challenges for actually advancing? And what we know is in some studies that men are being promoted during the pandemic and women are not. So we also have a couple of other studies after that are going to really focus on childcare issues and concerns, as well as homeschooling. Many people, in fact, some people are still homeschooling at least certain days of the week. We have many other ones, other research to run, you know, the statistics to run, but those are the few that are coming up most quickly.
Oh my goodness, ladies, there is so much more we want to talk about. Time has expired. Again, you've been hearing from Dr. Susan Madsen, Dr. Sarah McPhee-Lafkis. We thank you both so much for joining us here tonight. It's all going to be on abc4.com, so you do have a chance to get this information, be a part of the discussion. Again, thanks for spending your Friday evening with us here at ABC4.
Thank you.
Thank you.